The shrine world of Ilithia had always been a place of voices. Chanting voices. Singing voices. Pleading voices. For centuries, pilgrims had come from across the segmentum to kneel on its marble steps and raise their prayers to the God Emperor of mankind. The air was thick with incense, the skies filled with the tolling of 1,000 bells. It was said that on Ilithia, faith itself had weight, you could feel it pressing down like a hand upon the shoulder. The pilgrims believed the Emperor could hear them here, more than anywhere else in the galaxy. And for a time, that was enough. But on the day the skies turned black, Ilithia became a world of silence. They came by the millions to the great basilica, the largest shrine upon the surface, its spires like spears piercing the clouds. The marble steps were choked with bodies. Some were weary travelers with torn boots and empty satchels. Others were noble families, silks muddied and jewels dulled by the soot that rained from the heavens. All had come seeking one thing: protection. News had spread across the world in whispers carried faster than Vox transmissions: the Tyranids are coming. Entire provinces reported vanishing beneath a tide of chitin and claw. Cities went dark. Outlying shrines were cut off. Vox officers stammered half-messages of screaming, of gnashing teeth, of skies filled with wings. And then silence. The Astra Militarum had stood against the first waves, regiments raised from Ilithia's own proud defenders, bolstered by crusaders and scattered Imperial Navy detachments. But for every swarm crushed beneath artillery, 2 more surged from the horizon. The guard fell back. The PDF melted away. Even the Arbites had abandoned their precincts to make pilgrimage to the basilica, weapons clutched like relics, armor scorched and broken. The people of Ilithia gathered because there was nowhere else left. The basilica was not just a shrine, it was the largest fortress on the world, its foundations said to be blessed by saints, its gates reinforced with plasteel and ceramite. And so the pilgrims filled its nave, its cloisters, its very stairwells, chanting hymns to drown out their fear. They lit candles until the air was a haze of wax smoke and holy flame. They pressed close, shoulder to shoulder, as if the press of bodies could shield them from the horror closing in from beyond the basilica walls. Among them was Ilias Wren, a merchant whose caravan had once carried silks across the shrine roads. His goods had been lost weeks ago, devoured by the Tyranid tide, his guards ripped apart in screams that still haunted his sleep. Yet he clutched the ragged scrap of a banner, embroidered with the Aquila, as though it were a shield. Beside him knelt Sarah, a girl no older than 14, lips cracked from thirst, eyes hollow from grief. She carried her brother's skull wrapped in cloth, whispering prayers into its sockets, convinced his spirit could hear. They were not alone. There were thousands more like them, workers and priests, nobles and mendicants, soldiers stripped of rank, mothers clutching infants too weak to cry. Each face turned upward, gazing at the towering golden statue of the Emperor enthroned in judgment. They waited for him to speak. Hours passed. The air trembled with hymns, psalms recited over and over until the words blurred into one long chant. Priests strode the aisles, robes sweeping across the marble, voices booming. They promised miracles. They promised that the Emperor would not allow his most sacred shrine world to fall. They promised that light would burn away the darkness. But the promises rang hollow when the first thunder shook the stones. It came from far away, at first. A low, distant rumble that might have been artillery, or perhaps the earth itself crying out. Then another, closer. And another. Soon the walls shivered with each report. A woman screamed. A child clutched his father's robes, whispering, "They're here." Still, the priests demanded calm. Still, they urged faith. And still, the emperor was silent. When night fell, the sky outside the stained glass burned crimson. Ilithia's twin moons vanished behind clouds of smoke. The basilica's great bells tolled, not in joy, but in warning. The sound rolled through the nave like thunder, and for the first time in centuries, pilgrims stopped singing. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ilias felt it press against his chest, heavier than any fear he had ever known. He looked at the golden statue, its eyes cast eternally forward, mouth carved in eternal silence. He whispered a prayer anyway. "Please," he said. "Please speak." But the emperor said nothing. Outside the basilica, the screams had already begun. The pilgrims pressed tighter together as the sound carried through the walls. The wet tearing of flesh. The howls of beasts not born of mankind. The screams of soldiers breaking. Every voice seemed magnified by the basilica's stone, echoing as if the monsters were already inside. Sarah held the skull tighter, whispering prayers faster and faster. "He's listening," she insisted, "to no one in particular. He has to be. He'll answer. He'll come." But he did not. The emperor remained silent. And in that silence, a terrible thought spread through the pilgrims like a disease. What if he would not come at all? The basilica's great gates were sealed. The priests assured the faithful they were strong enough to hold until the miracle came. Yet cracks had already formed in the crowd. Fear gnawed at faith. Some whispered of running, though there was nowhere to run. Others clutched weapons, muttering of self-defense, though against what, none could say. And still, the thunder grew louder. By the second night, the Basilica of Ilithia was no longer a place of voices. The hymns had faltered, the prayers gone quiet. Only the bells still rang, tolling endlessly, their iron tongues drowning out the sound of screams that came ever closer. The pilgrims waited. They begged. They prayed. But the emperor's silence was the only answer. The shrine world of Gaethus Prime had always been a place of voices, prayers rising like smoke to the vaulted heavens. Its spires cut the clouds, their Gothic arches blackened by centuries of incense and flame. Pilgrims thronged the streets in endless tides, their whispers and chants feeding into the eternal litany of devotion to the corpse emperor. For many, this world was the end of a long journey, for others, it was merely a station along the pilgrimage routes that spanned the Imperium. But now the voices were changing. The bells of Gaethus Prime did not ring with celebration. They groaned like iron lungs drowning in smoke. The air carried no hymns of peace, only the acrid scent of burning promethium as Arbites herded civilians into the great Basilica of St. Muriel. The faithful stumbled in masses, clutching relics, rosaries, fragments of parchment inked with Holy Writ. Many bore their children on their shoulders, their faces streaked with ash, fear, and the long grime of the march. For above the shrine world's skies, the stars had gone dark. At first, it was a whisper among the Void Watchers, movement detected beyond the planetary halo, vast objects gliding in unnatural silence. Then came the shrieking augurs, readings spiraling into madness. And finally, silhouettes in the void, leviathans eclipsing the light of distant suns. Their forms were obscene, like wounds torn in reality, vessels of chitin and bone that pulsed with malignant hunger. The Tyranids had come. Within the basilica, the pilgrims gathered in such numbers that the air grew hot, choking, alive with the smell of sweat and incense. The vaulted ceiling loomed like the ribcage of a giant, its stained glass windows painting saints in fractured light. At the high altar, priests in gold-threaded vestments thundered their sermons, their voices cracking with desperation. "Do not falter," cried Cardinal Hestephon, raising a crozius high, its jeweled head gleaming in the torchlight. "The Emperor sees your faith. He hears your prayers. His angels shall descend, clad in ceramite and flame, to deliver us from this Zeno's blasphemy." The crowd responded with ragged cries. Some raised their relics high, others pressed their foreheads into the marble floor, whispering fevered devotions. Yet beneath the chorus of faith, doubt lingered. The faces of mothers and fathers were drawn tight with fear, children whimpering in their arms. The memory of the sky filled with writhing shadows had burned into their souls. Among them was Lyrian, a seamstress from the Hive slums of Silith district. She had spent her life saving for this pilgrimage, a journey to kneel before the altar of Saint Muriel. Now her faith wavered as she listened to the screaming beyond the walls. Somewhere outside, the Arbite's gunfire rattled like rain, only to be silenced in bursts of inhuman screeches. Beside her, her son Kalen, no more than 12 years old, clutched a small wooden carving of the Aquila. His lips moved in prayer, though his eyes betrayed his terror. "Mother," he whispered, "will the angels come? The Space Marines, they will save us, won't they?" She could not answer. The sound of the outside world pressed ever closer. Heavy impacts shook the earth, dust spilling from the vaulted ceilings. Somewhere in the distance, the shriek of an air raid siren cracked, only to dissolve in static. The ground quaked again, and this time the great doors of the basilica trembled on their hinges. Cardinal Hestephon's voice faltered for the briefest instant. The priests behind him began to chant the litany of endurance, their voices rising to drown the fear in the hall. "Faith is our shield," the cardinal bellowed, striking his crozius against the marble steps. "Faith is our armor. The Emperor tests us in fire, but he will not abandon us. Pray harder. Pray louder. Drown the Xenos with the power of belief." And so they prayed. The basilica thundered with voices, thousands upon thousands crying out to a God who could no longer hear them. The sound became a storm of desperation, every syllable a plea to halt the darkness clawing at the doors. Lyrian clutched her son tight, her voice hoarse with whispered devotions, even as her heart screamed in silence. Above the planet, the Tyranid hive fleet swam closer. Their tendrils writhed through the void like veins, pumping ichor into the swollen forms of their ships. Organisms the size of cities lurked in their shadows, their shapes bristling with spines, their maws yawning open like planetary wounds. Clouds of mycetic spores descended through the atmosphere, burning trails of sickly green fire. Where they landed, screams followed. The Basilica of Saint Muriel became a fortress of prayer. Pilgrims barricaded doors with pews, clutching relics as if the gold and bone could ward off monsters. Outside, lost fires streaked through the night, joined by the thunder of autocannons. But those who manned the walls fell silent too quickly, their cries replaced by the wet sounds of tearing flesh and the clicking shrieks of alien throats. For every prayer, a scream answered. Lyrian raised her eyes to the great statue of the God Emperor behind the altar. The figure towered in gilded armor, its face frozen in eternal serenity, hands raised in judgment and blessing. The candles at its feet burned low, their flames trembling in the drafts that swept through the hall. "Why does he not answer?" she whispered, voice breaking. But only silence came. Silence, and the distant sound of claws scraping against stone. The pilgrims of Gaethus Prime prayed on. And outside, the Tyranids came closer. The night of Gaethus Prime deepened into something unnatural. The stars had vanished beneath a choking haze, the sky torn open by falling spores that burned green streaks across the heavens. From the steps of the basilica, watchers could see distant fires blooming in the Hive districts, each one marking the death of thousands. Yet within the basilica walls, the priests demanded silence, silence for prayer, silence for the emperor. The pilgrims obeyed. Their prayers were whispered, gasped, shouted, but no matter their volume, the silence pressed heavier still. It was the silence of a god who did not answer. Brother Sergeant Malrek, one of the last of the planet's Frateris Templars, stood near the barred gates, his chainsword dripping with ichor. His armor, once ceremonial, now bore the fresh scars of battle. He had fought in the outer courtyards, cutting down creatures that had burst from the night like phantoms, their claws slicing through men and steel alike. "We cannot hold here," he muttered to Inquisitorial Adept Serenia, a stern woman cloaked in black parchment and sigils. She clutched a data slate, its screen cracked, displaying the failing Vox channels of the planet. "You will hold," Serenia hissed, her voice sharp enough to cut through the prayers. "The Emperor watches. These pilgrims must not see weakness." Malrek's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. He looked once at the people huddled in terror, families, the old, the infirm, children, and wondered how many breaths remained to them. The sounds outside shifted. No longer the chaos of battle, but a crawling hush, broken by the wet scrape of chitin against stone. Occasionally, something vast bellowed, shaking the basilica's very foundations. Each time, the pilgrims pressed closer together, clinging to icons until their knuckles whitened. Lyrian held Kalen tightly. She felt his small body tremble, his breath shallow. She whispered prayers for him, though each word turned bitter on her tongue. Her faith had always been steady, but now she wondered if the Emperor's throne was truly occupied, or if his golden husk merely mocked them from the void. Cardinal Hestephon raised his arms again, his robes shimmering in the glow of candlelight. "The Tyranid swarm tests us," he declared, voice echoing off stone. "And yet, are we not chosen? Did not Saint Muriel herself defy the alien with naught but her faith and her blood? Kneel, children. Kneel and cry out. If your voices reach high enough, he will hear us. He must hear us." And so they knelt. Thousands bent as one, foreheads to stone, lips moving in fervent repetition. The walls trembled again, dust falling from saints carved into the rafters. Still, no answer came. Hours bled together. The pilgrims' prayers turned hoarse, throats raw from endless litanies. Some fainted from hunger, others from terror. A few whispered doubts, only to be struck down by the ecclesiarchy's guards, their blood staining the marble floors. "Doubt is treason," hissed one priest, dragging a broken old man by his hair. "The Emperor hears all. He punishes disbelief." The crowd recoiled, silence heavier than their prayers. At the gates, something slammed, once, twice, then a third time. Each blow thundered like a battering ram. Splinters of ancient wood cracked, metal bolts screamed. The pilgrims shrieked, but the priests redoubled their chants, voices rising into hysteria. Malrek strode forward, chainsword growling to life. "They are testing the doors," he said grimly. "It won't hold forever." Adept Serenia's eyes narrowed. "Then the Emperor will decide our worth. Let them break. Let faith prove itself in the ashes." From outside, the first screams rose again. Not the screams of pilgrims, but of defenders, Arbites and militia, their lines faltering beneath the tide. Over it all, the shrieking voices of the Tyranids carried like knives across the night. One pilgrim, a young girl, broke from the crowd. She pressed her hands against the great door, tears streaming. "Please," she sobbed to the statue looming behind her. "Please, Emperor, save us." The basilica answered only with silence. Within that silence, something shifted among the people. A murmur of despair ran through them like a contagion. Some clutched their children and wept openly. Others began to pound the floor with their fists, demanding to know why their god remained mute. "Where are his angels?" one man screamed. "Where are the space marines?" The priests drowned him out with hymns, but the damage was done. Doubt had taken root. Kalen looked up at his mother, his voice trembling. "Mother, does he hear us?" Lyrian stared at the statue of the emperor, its golden face expressionless. For the first time in her life, she could not lie to her son. Her lips moved, but no words came. The silence answered for her. Above them, the stained glass shattered as the first spore creature slammed into the basilica's roof. Screeches echoed, claws scraping stone. Dust rained like ashes upon the faithful. Panic erupted as shadows writhed across the ceiling. The Tyranids were inside. The Basilica of St. Muriel groaned under the assault. The spore creature's weight had collapsed part of the roof, showering shards of colored glass into the nave. The pilgrims screamed as jagged saints rained down, their painted faces shattered beneath frightened hands. Brother Sergeant Malrek hacked at the first Tyranid that forced its way through the breach, the chainsword shrieking as it chewed through chitin and bone. He was fast, precise, but the enemy was endless. Each kill was drowned in the howls of more climbing claws. "Seal the breach," he roared, voice raw. "By the throne, get me fire." But there was no fire, no weapons beyond crude blades and candlesticks. The pilgrims had only their faith, and faith could not burn a Tyranid alive. The cardinal stood unmoved, his robes untouched by dust though the air swirled with ruin. He raised the icon of the Aquila high, his voice booming. "The Emperor tests us. He will not abandon his children. Hold fast, and the angels will descend upon us." His words washed over the terrified masses, but this time fewer believed. They heard only the screams outside, the wet crunch of bodies, the claws tearing at the doors. Lyrian pressed Kalen beneath her cloak, shielding him from falling debris. Her lips shaped prayers, but her heart faltered. Each scream outside carved at her faith. Each thundering silence from the heavens deepened the void inside her. Adept Serenia's eyes scanned the cracking data slate, the Vox channels now nothing but static. No signals. No reinforcements. The swarm is blotting every transmission. She turned sharply to the cardinal. "Your miracle isn't coming. We need to act. Evacuate to the catacombs before we're overrun." But the cardinal's face hardened. To abandon the basilica is heresy. The emperor's spirit resides here. Leave, and we forsake salvation. Malrek spat blood onto the stones. Salvation won't matter when claws are in their bellies. The clash of doctrine and survival rippled through the chamber. Pilgrims stared, torn between the comfort of faith and the instinct to run. The silence of the emperor pressed upon them all, heavier than the stone walls that shook with each new blow. Then came the moment of fracture. A man broke from the crowd, clutching a jagged shard of glass like a knife. "The emperor has abandoned us," he screamed, his voice ragged with terror. "We are meat for the beasts, nothing more. Save yourselves." Before anyone could move, the priest seized him, dragging him to the altar. His screams of despair echoed as they silenced him with a blade across the throat, blood spilling upon the steps meant for worship. Some pilgrims gasped. Others wept. But none spoke against it. The lesson was clear: doubt meant death. Malrek watched the lifeless body fall and felt something shift in the air. Not the resolve of faith, but the brittle shell of fear cracking. These people would not last. Their prayers had become screams in waiting. Faith cannot stop claws, he murmured, too quiet for the priests to hear. Kaelin's small voice whispered from beneath Lyrian's cloak. "Mother, is the Emperor angry with us?" Her throat ached. She wanted to say no, that he loved them, that salvation was coming. But the silence in the basilica was louder than any hymn, deeper than any prayer. She kissed his hair and whispered only, "Stay close to me." Above them, the ceiling groaned again. Another impact shook the basilica, dust cascading like snow. The Tyranids circled, relentless, patient. Each scream outside cut shorter than the last, replaced by a growing, suffocating hush. It was the hush of extinction drawing near. And still, the Emperor did not answer. The basilica could no longer hold its breath. The walls that had once echoed with hymns of devotion now shook under the thunder of claw and carapace. Each impact on the gates rang like a death knell. The pilgrims clung to icons, knelt before statues, wailed prayers that cracked with terror. But their hymns were drowned by the sound of wood splintering, iron bolts twisting loose, and the shriek of the alien swarm pressing closer. Then, with a sound like thunder splitting the heavens, the great doors burst inward. The first Tyranid leapt through, a monstrous warrior beast, its talons glistening with blood, its head a crown of chitinous ridges. It landed among the faithful like a wolf among lambs. One swipe of its scything claws tore 3 pilgrims apart, their screams ending in wet silence. The basilica erupted in chaos. Brother Sergeant Malrek roared, chainsword revving into a growl of steel. He charged, meeting the beast head-on. His blade screeched as it chewed through carapace, spraying ichor across the marble. The Tyranid shrieked but did not fall. Another lunged behind it, jaws snapping, talons ripping through a priest who raised his Aquila in vain defense. The nave became a slaughterhouse. Candles were overturned, icons trampled beneath panicked feet. Faith was replaced by survival, prayers by screams. Lyrian gripped Kaelin's hand and pulled him into the crush of bodies, heart hammering. She could smell the copper of blood, the stench of alien ichor. She saw a child torn from his mother's arms, vanishing beneath the claws of a beast. "Run," she gasped, though there was nowhere to run. The basilica was vast, but it was a cage. The pilgrims collided with one another in their desperation, trampling those who fell. Kaelin's small voice whimpered, "Mother, the angels, where are the angels?" But Lyrian had no answer. At the altar, Cardinal Hestephon still cried out, his voice rising above the carnage. "Stand firm. The Emperor tests us. Faith will shield you." His sermon ended with a talon through his chest. The Tyranid lifted him like a rag doll, his blood spattering across the golden Aquila he had so desperately clung to. His final breath rattled into silence as the beast hurled his body aside. The sight shattered what little courage remained. The pilgrims screamed as one, their last tether to faith severed. Malrek fought like a man possessed, his chainsword hacking through limb and torso, each swing a hymn of desperation. But even he knew the truth, there were too many. For every beast he cut down, 2 more surged forward, spilling through the shattered gates, climbing down from the sundered ceiling, filling the basilica with their screeches. "Fall back," he roared. "To the catacombs. Move." Adept Serenia seized the moment, her voice like iron. You heard him. Down the passageways. Save yourselves if you can. But many did not hear. Many were already dead. The Basilica of St. Muriel collapsed into pandemonium. Statues toppled, pews splintered, sacred banners burned as living torches were hurled into them by the beasts. Pilgrims swarmed toward the stairwells that led beneath the shrine, but the crush of bodies turned the exits into slaughter zones. Some were trampled, others cut down as the Tyranids plunged into the fleeing masses. Blood slicked the marble floors. The Emperor's throne remained silent. Lyrian shoved Kaelin toward a stairwell, her arms aching as she fought through the mob. She could hear the chittering behind her, closer now. A man fell at her feet, his stomach ripped open, and she dragged Kaelin away before the boy could see. Don't look, she whispered, though her own eyes burned with horror. Ahead, Malrek's voice cut through the chaos. He stood at the stairwell entrance, chainsword flaring, holding the line so civilians could stumble past him. His armor was slick with blood, some his, most not. His face was a mask of exhaustion, but his stance was unbroken. Move, he shouted. If you live, then the Emperor lives in you. Go. Lyrian pushed Kaelin through the gap. The boy stumbled, nearly falling down the steps, but she caught him, clutching him to her chest. Behind them, the screams rose again as another wave of Tyranids crashed into the basilica, tearing through flesh, wood, and stone alike. For a heartbeat, Lyrian glanced back. She saw the basilica, the place she had come to for salvation, the heart of her faith, now transformed into a charnel house. Statues of saints lay broken, their stone eyes gazing coldly upon the carnage. The altar was slick with blood. And still, above it all, the golden figure of the Emperor remained unmoved, silent, watching. No miracle came. As the survivors fled into the catacombs, the Basilica of St. Muriel filled with the roars of the swarm. The walls shook, the roof collapsed, and the prayers of thousands were silenced in a single night. The corpse emperor's silence was absolute. The stairwell swallowed them in darkness. The stone was slick with centuries of candle smoke and old wax, the air heavy with dust and incense that could no longer mask the stench of blood drifting from above. The survivors stumbled downward, pilgrims, priests, the broken remnants of families. Their footsteps were frantic, echoing off the narrow passage as if the walls themselves whispered their terror back to them. Lyrian clutched Kaelin's hand, refusing to let go even as the crowd pushed and jostled. His face was pale, lips trembling. Mother, it's so dark. She forced her voice steady. It's only the Emperor's shadow. Stay close. But inside she feared the shadow belonged to something else. At the rear, Brother Sergeant Malrek limped into the passage, chainsword hanging heavy in his hand. His armor was cracked, ichor drying in jagged streaks. His eyes burned with exhaustion, but still he stood between the civilians and the horrors above. Adept Serenia kept pace beside him, her data slate held like a relic. The catacombs stretch for miles, she said, her voice low, as though afraid the walls themselves might listen. If we reach the ossuaries, there may be sealed doors. We can hold there. Hold. Malrek's lip curled. For what? Reinforcements that aren't coming. A miracle that won't fall. She met his gaze, cold and unwavering. For time. Even time is worth blood. Behind them, the basilica roared with collapse. The swarm's shrieks echoed faintly down the stairwell, accompanied by the sound of stone crumbling. Pilgrims gasped, some falling to their knees to pray again, others clawing forward, desperate to outrun the noise. One priest raised his arms in the gloom. "Do not falter. The Emperor guided us here, beneath his holy shrine. He tests us still, but his light will shine again." His sermon was met with silence. The people's prayers had grown thin, stripped to murmurs and sobs. The passage widened into the first chamber of the catacombs. Lanterns sputtered to life, their flames weak, barely holding back the dark. The chamber was lined with the bones of saints, skulls stacked in solemn patterns, hollow eyes staring at the intruders. The pilgrims recoiled. Even in their desperation, they feared disturbing the sanctity of the dead. Lyrian whispered to Kaelin, "Do not look too long." But he already was, wide-eyed, staring at the skulls as if they might speak. The silence pressed thicker here. No hymns, no sermons, only the rasp of breathing, the shuffle of feet, the occasional sob. Every sound felt magnified, echoing too long, as if the bones themselves listened and judged. "Keep moving," Malrek ordered, his voice gravel. "The swarm will not stop at the basilica. These tunnels will not protect us forever." But the pilgrims hesitated. Some sank against the walls, clutching rosaries. Others argued in whispers, whether to trust the priests, whether to flee deeper, whether the Emperor had abandoned them. One woman broke the silence, her voice sharp with grief. "We prayed. We bled on his altar. And still he did nothing. Tell me, priest, where was he when my son was torn apart above?" The priest faltered, his words crumbling. "The Emperor, he hears. He tests." But the woman's laughter was hollow, jagged. "No. He is silent. And his silence kills us." Her words rippled through the chamber. Some nodded. Others wept harder. Faith wavered like a dying flame. Lyrian pulled Kaelin close, shielding him from the despair. Yet even she felt the truth of the woman's words. The silence had become unbearable. Kaelin whispered again, "Mother, will he come?" Lyrian held him tighter. Her lips shaped a prayer, but no sound left her throat. Malrek stepped forward, his chain sword sparking as he rested it against the stone. "Listen well," he growled, voice cutting through the gloom. "You can pray, or you can despair. But know this, only steel stands between you and the beasts above. If you falter, if you break, they will devour you and your children before the hour is done. Hold yourselves together, or you die here in the Emperor's silence." His words stilled the murmurs. Harsh, but true. A tremor shuddered through the stone. Dust sifted down from the ceiling, and somewhere in the darkness, a faint screech echoed. The swarm had not forgotten them. The pilgrims huddled tighter, eyes wide, breaths shallow. The Emperor remained silent. The catacombs breathed like a tomb. Damp stone pressed in from every side, the lantern's glow smothered by shadows that seemed to whisper and move. The pilgrims huddled in clusters, clinging to one another, listening, always listening, for the sounds from above. At first it was only silence, broken by the drip of unseen water. Then came the distant rumble, faint but growing. A vibration through the floor, a pressure in the chest. The swarm was not finished. Brother Sergeant Malrek froze mid-step, helm tilting upward. "They're burrowing," he muttered. His chainsword growled as he primed it, the sound harsh in the stillness. A murmur spread among the people, rising into fear. "Burrowing. Here. But the catacombs are sacred. Sacred stone won't stop them," Malrek snapped. The first crack split the ceiling like lightning. Dust rained down, choking the chamber. Screams erupted as claws tore through the stone, slick with alien ichor. The pilgrims scattered, their prayers shattering into panic. Lyrian pulled Kalen behind a pillar of skulls, holding him so tightly he could barely breathe. She tried to whisper calm, but her voice shook as the stone above split wider. Through the jagged hole, something massive forced its way in. A Tyranid warrior, its carapace glistening, its maw dripping venom. Its shriek split the chamber like a blade. The priests fell to their knees, wailing hymns. The pilgrims cried out for the emperor. But the emperor gave no answer. Malrek roared, charging forward, chainsword blazing. His blade bit deep into the beast's arm, sparks flying with each strike. The Tyranid screeched, countering with a sweep that hurled him against the wall. His armor dented, blood smeared, but he dragged himself back up. The chamber became chaos. A second Tyranid dropped through the breach, smaller but faster. It skittered across the bone-lined walls, slicing through a pilgrim before she could scream. The others surged away, trampling one another, their prayers dissolving into sobs. Adept Serenia grabbed a lantern and hurled it against the wall. Flame splashed, fire catching on wax and bone. The sudden light made the beasts recoil, if only for a heartbeat. "This way," she shouted, pointing toward the lower tunnels. "Move, now." The pilgrims hesitated, torn between firelight and fear. Another body fell in two pieces before their eyes. That broke their paralysis. They ran. Lyrian dragged Kalen into the surge of bodies, shoving through the narrow archway that led deeper into the catacombs. Behind her, the chamber became a slaughter. The priests, too slow to rise, were torn apart where they knelt. Malrek's chainsword shrieked, cutting through flesh and bone, but more claws raked at him, pinning him beneath their weight. Serenia looked back once, her eyes catching his across the chaos. He bellowed a final order, "Protect them." Then the swarm swallowed him. The survivors plunged into the next tunnel, darkness pressing tighter. Their breaths were ragged, their sobs unrestrained. Children cried, mothers stumbled, men clutched broken relics as though they might become shields. Kalen tugged at Lyrian's sleeve, whispering in terror. "Mother, will he come after us?" The Emperor. She had no words left. Only the sound of her heartbeat and the pounding of feet in the dark. Behind them, the screeches echoed louder. The swarm had found the way. The catacombs that once held saints now promised only graves. Serenia forced the survivors onward, her voice cutting through their panic. "Faster. Every moment you slow, they gain ground." The pilgrims pushed harder, even as exhaustion clawed at their lungs. Their faith faltered with every step, but their fear drove them forward. At last the tunnel widened into a vault. Here, rows of sarcophagi lined the walls, statues of long-dead heroes looming in judgment. The air reeked of dust and decay, but it was space, space to gather, space to breathe. The survivors collapsed against the walls, clutching one another. Some prayed again, but their prayers were thin, fragile, laced with doubt. Lyrian sank to her knees, holding Kalen close. He pressed his face into her shoulder, trembling. She tried to believe the words forming in her throat. "We will live, Kalen. We will." The Emperor. He must hear us. But the silence of the vault gave no answer. Somewhere in the tunnels behind them, the Tyranids screamed. The sound carried like a promise. The Emperor still did not speak. The vault was vast, but it felt like a coffin. Its walls stretched into shadow, lined with sarcophagi of saints whose names had been etched away by centuries of incense smoke. Candles, half-burned and long forgotten, stood in wax puddles like a frozen tide. The faint glow of their remnants trembled with the breath of those gathered. The pilgrims crouched together in clusters, clutching relics, rosaries, and scraps of parchment scrawled with prayers. They had fled fire and death, but here the silence gnawed at them worse than the Tyranids' screams. A child whimpered. A mother hushed him with words that lacked conviction. The darkness made every whisper sound like heresy. Adept Serenia stood at the center of the vault, back straight despite the sweat soaking her robes. Her hand gripped a censer chain, though no incense burned within it. Her voice, however, still carried the weight of ritual. "We are not abandoned," she said. "This is the Emperor's trial. His silence tests our devotion. The Xenos claw at our walls, but faith will hold them back. Faith is our fortress." The words echoed through the chamber, falling into the silence like stones into a pit. Some nodded, clinging to her certainty. Others looked away, their faces hollow. Lyrian kept Kaelin pressed close, his head against her shoulder. The boy's small voice broke the hush. "But mother, if he hears us, why doesn't he answer?" The question struck harder than claws. Serenia's expression flickered, but she did not falter. "The Emperor speaks through trial. Through silence, he demands strength. Every scream, every shadow, he measures us by how we endure." A voice from the crowd snapped back. "Endure." A pilgrim stepped forward, his face twisted with grief. Blood stained his sleeves, he had carried someone who had not made it. His voice cracked as he shouted. "We prayed when the bells rang, we prayed when the sky split, we prayed when the beasts poured into the streets. Where was he? My daughter begged for his light as they dragged her away, and all I heard was silence." Gasps rippled through the pilgrims. Some clutched their icons tighter. Others turned their eyes downward, as if hearing his words made them complicit. Serenia drew herself taller. "Blasphemy will doom us all." But the men did not back down. His voice shook, but he pressed on, "Or maybe we were doomed already. Maybe his silence means he doesn't care. Maybe," his words faltered, but he forced them out. "Maybe he is nothing but a corpse on a throne, just as they whisper in the alleys." The chamber broke into chaos. Some pilgrims fell to their knees, wailing. Others shouted at the men, curses mingling with desperate prayers. Fists clenched. Faces twisted with terror and rage. The vault had become a storm, not of Tyranids, but of despair. Lyrian shielded Kaelin's ears, though the boy still heard every word. She could feel his trembling, his fear. And in truth, she shared it. The silence pressed heavier than stone. Serenia raised her censer and struck it against the floor with a clang. The sound silenced the chamber. Her voice was a blade. "Would you rather turn your hearts to the great devourer? Do you think the Tyranids care for your grief? They consume. They strip worlds bare. They leave nothing but dust and bones. Would you rather offer your child to their jaws, or hold fast in faith and give him a chance at salvation?" The man's defiance crumbled. He sank to his knees, sobbing. The chamber grew quiet again, but the quiet was brittle, ready to shatter. And then came the sound. A low tremor through the walls. Dust trickled from the ceiling. The vault shook with distant pounding, like fists against a coffin lid. The swarm was digging closer. The pilgrims screamed. Some ran for the far tunnels. Others collapsed in prayer, voices high and desperate. Serenia shouted over the din form lines. Gather your torches. We can drive them back with fire, if only long enough to retreat deeper. A few rallied, rushing to obey. Others froze, paralyzed by terror. Lyrian grabbed Kalen and pressed him against the wall, whispering frantically. Stay with me. Do not run. Do not stop. The pounding grew louder. Stone cracked. A web of fractures spread across the wall, glowing faintly with alien ichor. Then, with a sound like bone splintering, claws broke through. The first Tyranid tore into the vault. A smaller beast, its carapace ridged and glistening, its tongue tasting the air. It shrieked, the sound like metal scraping glass. The pilgrims scattered. One threw a torch, its flame caught against the beast's flesh, and it recoiled. The brief triumph was drowned in more screams as two more creatures clawed their way in, their talons slashing through bone and stone alike. Blood sprayed. A pilgrim fell, torn in half before he could beg the Emperor for mercy. Kalen cried out. Lyrian yanked him back, pulling him toward the crowd surging toward the deeper tunnels. The vault filled with shrieks, human and alien alike. Serenia stood at the breach, censer raised like a weapon. Hold them back. In his name. Her words were drowned by the screech of claws against stone. The swarm poured in. The survivors fled. Feet pounded against the cold floor, breath ragged, hearts hammering. Behind them, the vault became a slaughterhouse. Relics smashed. Prayers silenced. The bones of saints shattered beneath Tyranid claws. Lyrian pushed forward, half dragging Kalen, her strength fueled by terror alone. The Emperor still did not answer. But the Tyranids did. Their roars filled the catacombs. Their presence devoured all else. The silence of the God Emperor was swallowed by the screams of his faithful. The survivors stumbled through the tunnels, the vault screams still echoing behind them. Their torches guttered in the stale air, casting jittering shadows on walls etched with saints' names. The catacombs stretched endlessly, a labyrinth beneath the shrine, but each path felt the same: stone, dust, darkness. Lyrian's arms ached from holding Kalen, but she would not let go. His small hands clutched her robes as tightly as if they were the only anchor in a sea of nightmares. Keep moving, Serenia commanded from the front. Her voice trembled, but she forced strength into every syllable. The Emperor guides us deeper. His will lights our path. But her words were drowned by the swarm. Their screeches rolled through the tunnels, vibrating in the stone. The Tyranids followed, closer with each breath. The refugees rounded a corner and came to a halt. Before them, an ancient gate of gold and iron loomed, its surface carved with images of the Emperor in triumph. Angels spread wings above him, and at his feet lay a galaxy subdued. Serenia's eyes blazed with tears. A sign, she whispered. The inner sanctum. His chosen refuge. The pilgrims surged forward, voices cracking in desperate praise. They clawed at the gate, pushing, dragging their nails over the engravings. And with a groan of ancient hinges, the doors opened. Inside lay a chamber unlike the vault. This place shone. Its walls were covered in golden mosaics, reflecting the light of still-burning braziers. The air smelled of incense that had burned unceasingly for centuries. And at the center stood an altar, its marble face gleaming, upon which rested a relic, a sword, impossibly bright even in the dimness. Serenia fell to her knees, sobbing. The Emperor provides. The chamber erupted in prayer. Some pilgrims rushed forward, pressing hands against the altar, begging for miracles. Others collapsed, overwhelmed. Even Lyrian, who had begun to doubt, felt a swell of something deep in her chest. Perhaps this was salvation. Perhaps he had answered after all. Serenia rose, voice ringing with power. Take up his relic. With it, we shall drive back the beasts. With it, his light will blaze against the swarm. The relic gleamed, alive with golden fire. Kaelin tugged at Lyrian's sleeve, whispering, "Mother." He did hear us. And for the first time since the invasion began, Lyrian wanted to believe. The pilgrims gathered around the altar, their voices rising in hymns. Serenia grasped the relic with both hands, lifting it high. Its blade flared brighter, golden fire spilling across the chamber. For a heartbeat, the survivors felt invincible. And then, the walls shook. The swarm struck the outer doors. Screeches and claws hammered at the gate of gold and iron. Stone dust rained from the ceiling. The chamber trembled as though the world itself recoiled. Serenia raised the relic like a standard. Do not fear. He stands with us. The gate cracked. Talons burst through, carving fissures into holy metal. A hiss of alien breath filled the sanctum. The pilgrims screamed, but Serencia's voice carried over them all. Stand with me. With his blade, we will triumph. She swung the relic down, striking the ground. Light flared outward in a blinding arc. For a moment, the swarm faltered. The nearest Tyranids shrieked, their carapaces smoking as golden fire scorched them. Pilgrims cheered, voices raw with newfound courage. See! Serenia shouted. He answers. The Emperor is with us. But the flame dimmed. The relic's glow flickered, then sputtered like a dying candle. The brilliance dulled to a faint glimmer. Serenia struck again, desperate, but no light came. The blade shone no brighter than common steel. The Tyranids roared, their fury redoubled. The gate shattered. The swarm poured in. Dozens of creatures, clawed, fanged, relentless, cascaded into the sanctum. The golden mosaics shattered beneath their talons. Braziers toppled, spilling fire across the floor. Pilgrims who had moments ago sung hymns were torn apart, their voices ending in choked screams. Serenia held the relic high, but the Tyranids closed in. The blade clanged against their armored hides, snapping like brittle glass. Shards fell from her hands, scattering across the altar steps. Her eyes went wide with horror, lips mouthing prayers that died unanswered. The beasts fell upon her. Lyrian clutched Kaelin, dragging him behind the altar as the swarm tore through the chamber. Blood sprayed across mosaics. Flesh ripped. Bones cracked. The faithful died where they knelt, prayers still on their tongues. Kaelin's voice shook, "Mother, why doesn't he stop them?" Lyrian could not answer. She could only hold him tighter, tears burning her face. The Emperor's silence was absolute. The screams of the faithful filled the sanctum. The Tyranids consumed without pause, without mercy, without end. The golden chamber was defiled, its mosaics drowned in gore, its relic shattered. And when the last voice was silenced, only the hiss of alien breath remained. In the aftermath, the swarm flowed out of the shrine like a black tide, leaving nothing but silence. The inner sanctum lay empty, its altar stained red, its relic broken. And in that silence, no miracle came. The corpse emperor had not spoken. The faithful had screamed, prayed, begged. But only the Tyranids had answered. The shrine world of Calaxis lay in ruin. Its spires, once crowned with statues of saints and angels, had been broken and blackened. The air was thick with spores that blotted out the sun, leaving the sky a choking bruise of green and gray. The oceans boiled with alien biomass, their waters stripped of life. Cities, once gilded with shrines and banners, were nothing more than husks gnawed hollow by the swarm. Orbiting above the dead world, the inquisitorial black ship Mercy of Judgment hung in silence. Its vast hull gleamed faintly in the dim starlight, its wards and purity seals fluttering uselessly in the void. Within its observation deck, Inquisitor Mydra stood alone, hands clasped behind her back, her gaze fixed on the corpse of the planet below. She was tall, her armor draped in dark robes, the inquisitorial rosette shining faintly at her chest. Her eyes were hollow. Behind her, the ship's astropath waited, trembling beneath the weight of psychic residue still clinging to the world. He had described it in fractured whispers, screams that never ended, voices that bled together into a chorus of despair, and then, nothing. A silence deeper than the void itself. The swarm has moved on, Mydra said quietly. Calaxis is stripped. The astropath nodded, sweat dripping down his pale skin. His voice cracked like dry parchment. Nothing remains, my lady. No souls, no prayers. Only echoes. Mydra's eyes narrowed. And no miracle. The words hung heavy in the chamber. The Inquisitor turned back to the world, her thoughts heavy with the reports she had already received. The local defense regiments had been annihilated within days. The shrine's relics had been smashed, its sanctums desecrated. The final Vox transmissions from within the catacombs had been maddening, prayers, screams, hymns rising into a crescendo of terror, cut off mid-breath. All of it had been catalogued by her scribes. All of it would be stored in the sealed archives of the Ordo Xenos, to be read by no one save her peers. And yet, as she stood here, the memory of those recordings weighed upon her like chains. The corpse emperor's silence, she murmured. That is all they heard. The astropath flinched at the phrase, but did not deny it. His blind sockets turned downward, as if ashamed. Hours later, Mydra descended to the ruined surface. Her escort, armored stormtroopers of the Inquisition, spread out in formation, weapons ready though no foe remained. The swarm had taken all. They passed through the carcass of the shrine city, its streets lined with bodies reduced to husks. Flesh and bone had been stripped of vitality, reduced to parchment skin clinging to broken frames. Statues of saints lay toppled, their marble faces devoured as though even stone could not escape the hunger. At the heart of the ruin stood the grand basilica. Its once golden gates were shattered, the mosaics of the emperor ground into dust. The doors hung askew, their hinges clawed apart. Mydra stepped inside. The air smelled of ash and blood, mingled with something alien and cloying. Her boots crunched over fragments of relics, over the bones of the faithful. Candles long since snuffed lay scattered like corpses themselves. And deeper within, she found the sanctum. The altar stood desecrated, its marble cracked, its surface black with blood. Shards of a relic blade lay scattered like forgotten teeth, their glow extinguished. The mosaics that once depicted the Emperor triumphant were ruined, stained red, claw marks carved across his face. The Inquisitor stood in silence, her gaze fixed upon the broken altar. This was the heart, she said softly, more to herself than to the soldiers at her side. Here they prayed. Here they screamed. Here they died. She reached down, lifting one fragment of the shattered relic. It was dull, lifeless, no different from common steel. She turned it in her hand, her gauntlet scraping its edge. "Hope," she whispered. This was their last hope. And it broke. Her stormtroopers shifted uneasily, their eyes darting to the shadows, though no movement stirred. One finally spoke, his voice low through the vox of his helmet. "My lady, what do we tell the ecclesiarchy?" Mydra closed her fist around the relic shard until its edge bit into her glove. "Tell them nothing. The ecclesiarchy will preach of martyrdom. They will say the faithful died in his service, that their screams were hymns. They will say silence was his will." She turned to face her soldiers, her eyes burning with a cold fury. "But we know the truth. We know what silence means. And silence is death." The stormtroopers bowed their heads, though unease lingered in their stance. Later, aboard the Mercy of Judgment, the Inquisitor dictated her final report. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of graves. Designation: Calaxis. Shrine World. Status: Consumed. Tyranid swarm stripped biosphere, eradicated population, defiled shrines. No survivors confirmed. No miracles observed. Ecclesiarchy relics destroyed. She paused, her voice hardening. Final note: the silence of the Emperor was absolute. Faith did not save them. Hope did not shield them. The faithful screamed, and only the void replied. Archive under Ordo Xenos Threat Index, Omega. The record clicked to an end. When she rose, Mydra returned once more to the observation deck. The world below was quiet now, its surface empty, its life consumed. It spun on in the void like a hollow skull, stripped of meaning. The astropath lingered nearby, his face pale, his hands trembling. "Do you believe, my lady?" he asked, his voice small. Mydra did not answer at first. Her eyes remained on the silent corpse of the shrine world. At last, she spoke, her voice low. "I believe in silence." And as the Mercy of Judgment turned away from the ruined world, its engines flaring against the void, the shrine planet of Calaxis was left to drift in darkness. No hymns rose from its cathedrals. No relics gleamed in its sanctums. No miracles shone from its skies. Only silence remained. Silence eternal.